use it anyway, just in case. Well, I want to thank you for having me. Thanks to Angelina for doing all the outreach and setup and everything. And thanks to Manny's for providing this space. And I was also thinking, oh, it's right after Pride. Maybe people aren't in the mood for going out anymore, but I really appreciate you being here. And the other thing I want to say is I really appreciate you all just taking some time for a moment to tuck away our grief and our rage about this Supreme Court decision and think about something happier like parole and incarceration. So, so I hope this is interesting and it gives a little bit of respite from what the other things going on in the world right now. I'm going to start a timer so I don't talk for too long. Okay. So this is research I started during the pandemic actually, and I continue to work on, and I'll be presenting it next month in Portugal, which I'm excited about. But I'm actually a little more excited to talk to all of you because you're just the people of San Francisco. You know, you're my peers, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about it. And it has to do with the process of parole in California and the role that rehabilitative programs play in that. And I'll talk about kind of how I came to this in a moment. But I want to start with a quote from my research that if you could go ahead and advance the slide. This is a quote from I sat in on parole board hearings, and this is a quote from one of them. One of the folks who was appearing before the parole board in hopes of being released. And he made this statement during his hearing. He said, "My crimes were, and will always be unforgivable and unbelievable. I do not deserve to be sitting at this table right here, right now, being considered for parole by you." He had been up for parole a few times and had spent quite a bit of time in prison by this point. He said, "You represent the entire community I once terrorized and betrayed." I've given this a pseudonym. And I would love to ask, except for my research assistant, Anne, who knows, who's sitting over there. Thank you, Anne. What do you think was the crime that this person committed, if you had to guess based on the quote? Anyone? Murder? Okay. Anyone else have a different answer? Stealing? Rape? And keep in mind, this is from a life sentence. Only people with life sentences go to the parole board. Okay. Good guesses. This isn't, what's that? Drug dealing. Excellent guess. So some of those don't usually catch a life sentence. Some of them do. This is a man who was caught outside of someone's window of a home he thought was vacant at the time, eyeing and trying to open the window to get to a purse, and was caught in the act of that. He actually didn't even complete a theft. He didn't enter the residence, but because of our 3 strikes law, this was his third, and it was a burglary, and he went to prison for life. And I thought, what is it that, makes someone take so much responsibility and what I would say over responsibilizing for something that makes it sound like he committed a murder, right? I mean, it really does. He terrorized the community by trying to take a purse out of a window. So I was interested in what is it about the structure of the parole board hearing process in California and the way we prepare people for parole that gives rise to this. If you could just advance the slide, I'll tell you, in academia, we call this methodology. In other words, just how do I know what I'm talking about? So real quick, I took the time during the pandemic and sat in via Zoom. That's how all the parole board hearings are happening. On 21 full parole board hearings in California. That represented various prisons throughout the state of California. I also gathered transcripts. And when I say I mean we, because my RA, Anne, was helping me with that. Can you wave your hand, Anne? And gathered a representative sample of 121 parole board transcripts from 2019 to 2021, and made it representative so that it's the same proportions of men versus women, of the different prisons of the area of California, the types of crimes, the types of sentence, et cetera, that you would see in the larger population of parole board hearings, which was 3,400 and change during that year. That's how many total complete board hearings happened. There were a bunch more that got canceled and so forth. So I observed some, I analyzed the transcripts of some, I had meetings with and spoke to and got information from the chief executive of the Parole Board in California, whose name is Jennifer Schaefer, and to see what their overall statistics were and such. And then I also, for this study, because I'm looking at programming history, what programs I do, I also drew on my experience as someone who, with another hat on, aside from my US staff job, spent 15 years running rehabilitative programs in San Quentin. And I continue to work with the reentry population out here. And so what I observed from the people I worked with, what I observed from building programs, carrying them out, evaluating them, and so forth. Okay, we'll go ahead. And I want to acknowledge these two guys up on the screen right now. An important part of my methodology was something called participatory action research, which in short terms means involving the population you're studying in leading the project, basically. And so my two buddies who I had met in San Quentin and were later paroled, Emil DeWeaver and Shaw Wallace Stepter, they're both here in the Bay Area now, both activists. One's a filmmaker, one runs a program for prison arts. They helped me. I brought them in early on and they were almost like my translators. They helped me understand the things in these transcripts and these hearings that a middle class white woman who's never been incarcerated wouldn't understand. So I want to acknowledge my co-researchers. Unfortunately, they were out of town. They weren't able to make it today. Okay. So quick primer on parole. Is anyone here in one of the legal professions or criminal justice who already knows how parole works? No? Okay, probably you, Kitty. So really quick primer just to understand what we're talking about. In California, we have two different types of sentences. There's determinate sentences and there's indeterminate sentences. All the sentences were indeterminate, meaning you don't know exactly when they're going to end until 1977. When under Jerry Brown, California passed the determinate sentencing law, which made almost all crimes, you have X number of years and that's it. And at the end you get out. Only a few crimes, murder, attempted murder, kidnap, robbery, and then we added 3 strikes and certain other things to that are now indeterminate, meaning 15 to life, 10 to life, 25 to life. And the parole board decides when you go home at that time, okay? I also want to distinguish between what's called discretionary parole release, which is what I'm talking about, the decisions that are made about who goes home when, versus post-release parole supervision, which is what happens after a person gets out, where they have a parole officer who supervises them from there. 2 totally separate systems. And then finally, I want to just say a word about Marcy's Law, which passed in 2008, the same year as Prop 8. And it greatly increased the number of years between parole board hearings, which had the effect of increasing the amount of time people spend in prison, because normally folks don't get out on their first parole board hearing. They have to do it over and over again. Okay, so that's just some basic background, and we can move on. In preparation for parole, the incarcerated folks usually spend about a year preparing, gathering documents, gathering letters of recommendation. You can click again. So these are copies of different documentations of all the programs that they've taken and that they send to the board. They have to have this. You can keep going. And all, the programs come in varying shapes and sizes and forms. Most prisons in California have an addiction program, have a GED program. San Quentin is by far the most active in programming. It's got over 70 different programs ranging from anger management to Criminals and Gang Members Anonymous to, it has the only accredited college program. So there's a lot of different programs there. And we can keep going. And just as a piece of background, I want to tell you where this conceptual framework comes from. In a prior study, which I won't bore you with it, where I interviewed incarcerated people in Ohio, what we found basically, my co-researcher and I, is that experience really matters in terms of how prisoners feel their punishment, okay? And when they expect it, even if it's severe, it doesn't feel so salient. They're not thinking about it in their day-to-day lives so much. So we think of a life sentence as very severe. right? They didn't think of it as severe once they did what one of the incarcerated folks called Jedi mind tricks and kind of downplayed it, because in many cases, this was because they either expected it or they felt like they deserved it. And you can go through all of these on here. One of my former research informants, who is currently incarcerated, said, "We believe we have more control over our mental state than our physical state." And so that's why the salience matters in terms of how they think about it, how heavily it weighs on them. And again, when you feel like you deserve something, you make it less important in your head. So that's the backdrop. Okay, let's move forward. Okay, so this is where what we call program speak comes in. I didn't come up with this phrase. My incarcerated and formerly incarcerated researchers did. And it's all that language that comes up that's associated with these different cognitive behavioral programs. Things like, and I think there's going to be more listed if you click again. Oops, no, it didn't. Okay, so some of it disappeared, but that's fine. You get the idea. Drinking thinking, anger is a secondary emotion, toxic shame, male role belief system. There are all these kind of pop psych terms that are taught in the prison that are then used in these parole board hearings to signify, I was a damaged person, I'm taking responsibility, I have remorse, I'm better now. Okay. So let me just give you one example from one of the parole board hearings I sat in on. And this was a guy named David. David had had a psychotic break on PCP and went out into a public area and started spraying bullets and ended up killing 2 people just on a rampage. And he had no memory of it. By the time he got to the police station, he blacked out entirely. And then the police interrogated him. That's when he found out what he had done. He gets sentenced to life in prison. He goes to prison. He's coming up for parole, and they're asking him about the crime. And, they're asking him why he did it. And he's giving them answers, knowing full well he has no clue. He never recovered that memory of why he did it or the moments before the murders. He said he didn't even know what was going on until when I woke up in the police station. He says, I'm responsible for what happened that night. He was under stress, et cetera, et cetera. He's taking responsibility for something he has no memory of, which is a tricky thing, right? You have to take responsibility, but they want details from him. He pressed further, he says, well, I wasn't a gang, but I was under a gang member mentality. I was doing the same thing they were doing. I was taking control over somebody. I had a rush to take control over somebody else. So he's adopting the language this is straight out of programs in prison. I hear it all the time. He's adopting this language to give them the answers that they want, even though he has no clue if it's true or not. He really can't explain what happened because he's not aware of it. So I was really interested in figuring out, why do people do this? Why do people take more responsibility than they maybe is accurate, right? In terms of, yes, I did this, I planned it, I carried it out, and so forth. So what I found was, and one of the things I was interested in was how this language gets around, how it gets diffused through the prison, the parole board, and it's really a symbiotic relationship. So these programs come about because the folks who are incarcerated need help going to the parole board. The parole board lays out certain demands. You need to show insight. You need to show remorse, things like that. And so programs form to teach these things. The folks who are incarcerated attend the programs, and then they take that language back with them to the cell blocks where they all talk to one another, and it diffuses through the entire life. In many prisons, the quote unquote lifers, the indeterminate folks life sentence folks who are going to the parole board, they all live together in one cell block. So they're all sharing information with each other. They're all taking these classes over and over to prepare for the parole board. And eventually many of the classes, including the 2 that I ran, end up prisoners don't get paid, but hiring in folks who have graduated from the program to then teach the program and further refine it. So it's this really cyclical thing. And there's no telling where it begins and where it ends, but it circulates through these. And then eventually the parole board gets wind of the language that's being taught in the prisons, and they adopt it into their requirements, right? And they put it back on the other prisoners and ask them about these phrases. So it's a funny little cycle that happens. And if you could click again, three things that are very crucial in this process are a little counterintuitive. In order to be found suitable for parole, number one, the goal is to appear as guilty as possible. Very different from the trial, right? When you want to appear as innocent as possible. In the parole board hearing, there's no such thing as innocence. There's no such thing as only partially responsible, bystander, whatever it is. I forgot. You have to take full responsibility for everything. Okay. And you have to make it, it's a very fine line. You have to make yourself, you have to acknowledge that you're the scum of the earth, but not so scary that you'd be a risk to public safety if they let you out. Right. Okay, the second thing is the insight requirement. The parole board goes through a number of different, every so often the Board of Parole Hearings comes up with a new scheme where this is a determining factor for getting out of prison. Right now it's insight, and it has been for a while, past probably the last 10 years. The person has to possess insight into their life crime and how their life led up to the moment of their life crime, and how their recovery led to this day where they're going to be successful outside. So in essence, they're asking you to draw a linear kind of linkage between your earliest memories as a child through your adolescence until all the way up to the day of your crime. And then from there through your prison time, and then projecting out and how it all links together. Now, I don't know about you, but that would be a daunting process for me. I don't know that I could make that much linear sense of my life in that way, right? Where every single thing links together and tells a story and contains all of those program speak words, right? Toxic shame and toxic masculinity and all those different things. So this insight requirement is very, very specific and is in the requirements for the parole board's decision-making. And then the final thing is that you're not allowed to what they call minimize, which means diminish your role in the crime or diminish the importance of it. And what they call minimizing is talking about anything that's not your own direct personal responsibility. In other words, social structural factors, family formations, neighborhoods, poverty, racism, nothing along those lines. Urban versus suburban differences, gender differences, nothing. All of that is minimizing your responsibility. You are solely responsible for what you do, no matter what, ignores all of your background and all of the social structures and social inequalities you experience. Okay, so those are very important features of what folks are looking for, what the commissioners are looking for in a parole board hearing. So let's advance, and I'll talk a little bit more about the role of program speak. So what we found in this research and in prior research is that this program speak is adopted in order to accomplish these goals. And it's adopted in varying degrees, you know, on the one, this wasn't originally my idea, it was Emile de Wever's, the person I showed you. So the first order, so to speak, of program speak is when you're learning the language that you need to use in the parole board. And it doesn't mean it's lying and it's not subterfuge, but it is a way, it's an understanding like, okay, here's how I have to talk to communicate that I'm okay. Okay. The second order of program speak is where it begins to be internalized, where it's not necessarily I need to use this word, and this word to get out, but it's I want to be what society wants me to be, right? I want to reflect the values of the broader society in general. And so I'm going to adopt some of these terms and some of these attitudes to show that I'm reformed and I'm accepting responsibility and I can be in society because I want to look like what the rest of the folks look like, basically. The third order of program speak is deeply, deeply internalized, where a person can no longer distinguish between the very, very personal responsibility focused, remorseful language they use in the parole board and their reality. And in fact, I've actually seen cases where I read the report, the police report, the forensics reports, and they don't match what the person had to tell the parole board in order to get out of prison, right? The ballistics report says you were 7 feet away. Well, the parole board's like, you were closer than that, weren't you? Because you were hunting that person down, right? You shot them from 3 feet. Yes, of course, I shot them from 3 feet. I don't know why I said 7 feet. You know, where a person convinces themselves. And what happens in that process is that they internalize the stigma that's involved in that. Because remember, all of this is about saying what a shitty person you are, excuse my language, right? And so that's what was deeply troubling to me, that I was seeing people get out of prison with their stories having transformed over the course of the parole processes, multiple times to the parole board, 8, 9, 10 more. One of the people had been 20 times. And their story shifting, and in some cases to a degree where they stick with their parole board story even after they're released. And it becomes their new reality. And you internalize, I'm the piece of shit that society thinks I am. And that made me, gave me some pause. We can go ahead and advance. So I'll give you one example, and this can be dangerous in certain circumstances. This is where I talk about the risks of redemption. So this is a different individual, I think, named David, maybe it wasn't. And this is one of the instances where the parole board adopts the program speak that comes up in the cognitive behavioral program. So they ask a person to list their character defects. And this is pretty standard. And this person is trying to think of stuff. And he, oh, no, I'm sorry. This was the same David who blacked out. So he didn't really have much to say. He's like, well, I used to be jealous of guys who used to try to talk to my girl friends, so that was a trigger. I had insecurities. He's trying to kind of give the person what they want in terms of character defects. And so as you look kind of yourself, you don't believe you ever engaged in any type of domestic violence. And then he says, I'd have to say yes. Keep in mind, this is for a random shooting on a psychotic break from PCP. It has nothing to do with his case, has nothing to do with his girlfriend. And he said, I have to say yes, I participate in domestic violence, but I haven't been physically domestic violence. They say, okay, what kind of domestic violence did you participate in? Causing problems. He's saying it in a questioning way, arguing, just putting stress on my girl like that. You see what happened? This guy's in prison for murder, right? They just got him to confess to domestic violence that never happened. The woman never filed a report. They interviewed her and she never said she said that she wasn't a victim of domestic violence. They invented a culpability that wasn't there before by using this language and using this mandate of responsibility and remorse. Okay, we can go ahead and forward. And so here's where this becomes really troubling for me. And this is one of the reasons why I want to study this. This pops up in unexpected places later on and comes back to bite these folks in the butt. And what I mean, and that happens mostly in two circumstances that I've seen at least. The first is in the course of filing for a resentencing petition. So there are a number of criminal justice reforms that have happened in the last few years, which allow people under certain circumstances to be resentenced to a shorter term based on this or that reform, based on their age, or if they were youthful offenders, they were under 18, based on various other circumstances. One of the ones that passed in 2018 was SB 1437. That was a law that reformed the felony murder rule. The felony murder rule basically says if you're present at all when a murder is committed or a killing happens, you are as responsible as the person who pulled the trigger. And so what this ends up doing is incarcerates a lot of drivers, basically people who are waiting in the car while the person says, wait, hold on, goes out, shoots someone, comes back and says, drive away, right? Or who was marginally involved even when that person was talking about it and planning it and then didn't take part in it. It doesn't matter what your role is. If you're present or even had conversations about a killing happening, You are sentenced as if you are the shooter or the stabber to life in prison, a minimum sentence of 25 to life. Okay, so we have a lot of people in prison doing time for this. SB 1437 reformed that and said, if you weren't actually, fully responsible for that murder, then you can apply to have your sentence changed to what you are responsible for, basically, being an accomplice or something like that, something lesser. And so a lot of these petitions were coming and they were being rejected. And mostly out of LA under the before RDA went to LA. But LA accounts for 40% of the people who are in prison. It sends 40% of the incarcerated folks there. And what they were doing in LA, Santa Cruz, some other places, is digging back through the individual's parole board hearing transcripts to find statements of culpability that made it look like they were the main player in order to deny their petition. In other words, they were combing through all these, character defects and group program speak and all of this stuff where you have to take so much responsibility. Remember, the goal is guilt in the parole board hearing. They were combing through all of that to find language that said, yes, I'm the person responsible, so that they could say, see, you weren't just the driver. You're the person you planned the whole thing. I got one case as an expert witness where the individual, this kid was asked by his friend to drive him to a parking lot. He drove his friend to a parking lot. He dropped him off and left, didn't see him till the next day. And that friend later met up with some fellow drug dealers. A drug deal went bad and they ended up killing a rival drug dealer. The individual that drove him to that parking lot and then left was doing life for murder. Okay. And his SB 1437 petition was denied by LA County prosecutors for this very reason, because over the course of and I had to go back through his transcripts from his various parole board hearings, there were about 5 or 6, and see how he took more and more responsibility over time in response to what he was hearing back from the parole board. Okay. Even more troubling, but more rare, are cases of actual innocence. We all know innocent people go to prison sometimes, right? We know that very well by now. And what happens when you're actually innocent, but you have to go through this parole process because you haven't been exonerated? You can't say you're innocent. You have to make yourself sound guilty. You have to accept responsibility for something you had no part in. And it really kind of presents a dilemma, which has been called the innocent prisoner's dilemma. What do you do? I personally know someone who was incarcerated out of LA as well, who was incarcerated for 34 years for murder he did not commit, was later exonerated, but he stopped going to his parole board hearings. He's like, what's the use? They just deny me every time unless I say I did it. Right? So that's your choice. You either stay in prison and never get paroled and hope someday some innocence project will pick you up and exonerate you, or you lie to tell them what they want to hear in order to get out. And that inculpates you. That makes you guilty. And so the case that came up most recently was a case called In Re Swanigan, where a guy named Fred Swanigan, and let me see if I can find the quote. This was in 2015. A guy named Fred Swanigan was in such a predicament. He was denied parole over and over again as a consequence of maintaining his innocence. Okay. And after 8 unsuccessful hearings, on his 9th trip to the parole board, he finally gave in. And he made a statement accepting responsibility for the crime and expressing remorse. And then afterward, they said, well, I don't know, because you just changed your story. Last time you said you were innocent. This time you're saying you're guilty. Something's going on. We're not going to let you out. You're going to have to come back again. And so before he came back for his subsequent parole board hearing, he was evaluated by a psychologist, which happens before every parole board hearing. And the psychologist said, what's going on? You said you did it. Did you do it? Did you not? He's like, no. He says, I was just telling them they wouldn't listen to me. I was telling them what they wanted to hear. They wouldn't let me out otherwise. He said, I'm being coerced. I'm never going to get out unless I accept responsibility, even though I'm not guilty. He literally made it up. Later had to go to the federal courts to get released. And so that's what the stake is, right? That's why we have to be concerned. Obviously, it's, the public is very concerned with people, mending their ways, people turning away from a life of crime, accepting, responsibility is important, remorse is important, but it can get to such an extreme where it's more damaging than helpful. In these types of situations, as well as where the person is so deeply stigmatized and has internalized the guilt that, maybe isn't appropriate for that person, especially in a state where we still have a 3 strikes law. And it could be a burglary that has you in prison for life. And I'll stop there, and I'm curious to hear all of your questions or thoughts or comments. And I don't know what time I'm at. And please ask them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really depends. So there's it depends on which piece of the puzzle you're talking about. On the one hand, LA, which, like I said, account for a lot of the people who go to the parole board, because it's a lot of people who go to prison, got RDA, Gascon, and he has stopped digging into the parole board hearing transcripts the way the former DA Jackie Lacey did. So that's one good thing. It's all a matter of who gets elected DA, though. In terms of the parole board process, there has been a shift. If I had done this study 10 years ago, it would have been a whole different picture. They wouldn't have even had catchphrases and standards you had to meet because it was so discretionary. It was really just parole commissioners deciding, do you deserve to get out or not? And it was almost no one who got out. And parole commissioners in those days were former correctional guards for the most part. About 10 years ago, the current chief executive of the parole board came in, Jennifer Schaefer. She's an administrative law practitioner by trade, brought a much different perspective. She was like, this can't be, and she told me this can't be on feelings. You have to have some kind of rubric for making these decisions. So she actually introduced this structured decision-making model, which helps to kind of structure the hearings so that there are at least some criteria. They can still feed things into that, like the insight requirement. And it helps in that there has to be some structure or reason for finding a person not suitable for parole. But again, it kind of depends on the commissioners. The other good thing that's happened that a lot of us have called for is increased vocational diversity in the parole board. So they've started bringing in more administrative lawyers and things like that. So it's not all former guards and wardens, although the former warden of San Quentin is now on the parole board. So that's one of the things, but it's tricky because, these are normally not seen by anyone else. It's a closed room and it's very hard to get public scrutiny on it. And the reason why I want to do a statewide study is to show these aren't anomalies, right? This is a pattern and it doesn't matter what prison you come from. And that's the best I can say about that. Yeah. Did you have a hand up? Oh, I'm so sorry. So she was asking, is there any movement for reform or introspection about how these things are done? Thank you. Oh, sorry. Hi. Yeah. One of them I just said, which is diversifying the backgrounds of the people on the parole board. I would like to diversify them further. I would like to see some defense attorneys in there, or some formerly incarcerated people. You know, when I had my two research associates helping me with these things, they're experts. You know, they're way more insightful, having been through this process, having taken all the programs. The parole board commissioners are just kind of hearing about these programs. They're not sitting in on them, so they don't know exactly what happens. The other thing that I think would be crucial is treating a parole board hearing as as we treat, you know, an interrogation, where there are certain protections in place, you know, where you have to, you are kind of represented by counsel, but obviously represented by counsel, and it's treated as a coercive environment the way an interrogation is, which means that you have more due process rights than a parole board hearing. And you have to take that into account when you evaluate these statements, and understand that the goal is different than in a trial, right? Just because a person says something in a parole board doesn't mean it's the facts, and that there's a particular, you know, so there's some education that has to happen in terms of the decision makers, but also just having people with different backgrounds who understand that would be great, and instituting the same procedures we have in place for a police interrogation. Yeah.
You're saying that they were like trying to find ways to deny. What is sort of the incentive there?
You're absolutely right.
So what's the incentive?
So I'll say this, this past term, the numbers I showed you had a higher percentage of finding people suitable than we've had in many years. Okay, so the numbers are reversing in terms of the percentage of parole grants versus denials. But the answer to your question in most cases is twofold. One is, well, they were former correctional officers who think nobody should ever get out of prison. And two, and that it shores up their jobs as correctional officers, right? You need prisoners to have guards and great benefits and a lot of job openings. And the second part is the same reason politicians don't get behind these reforms, because it doesn't look good to release someone who goes on to commit another crime. And they're worried about that. Now, having said that, I should tell you that this population, that indeterminately sentenced folks who, yes, commit the most severe crimes like homicide and attempted homicide, are the least likely to recidivate. In other words, they almost never commit another crime, let alone another murder. They have below a 2% recidivism rate. So these aren't our problems, even though they're very scary. But what happened, just a little bit of history to put this in context. California passed a law, I think in the early 80s, that is one of the few in the nation where the governor can reverse a parole board decision and take it away. And that started happening quite a bit. It doesn't make sense because the governor actually appoints the parole board. They're all serving at his or her discretion, right? But he can overturn them. And that's what happened under Gray Davis. And before him, I'm blanking on that governor's name, the Republican, Pete Wilson, thank you. They did that every single time practically. In 5 years in office, Gray Davis, a Democrat, let out 5 people because he didn't want to be the governor that let murderers out of prison, right? And then under Schwarzenegger, it was like 37 people or something like that. And so it wasn't until a California Supreme Court ruling that said you have to have a reason and also a change in governor that people ever started getting out, really. And so a governor doesn't want to take responsibility for that in an elected office. I appointed this person, they let this person out, that person went on to kill someone or try to kill someone. So, you know, it's the same political pressures. Yeah. Yes, I was afraid you were going to ask that. I have it somewhere. So let's see if I can find that. Okay, so There were actually 7,600 parole, sorry, let me move this. There were 7,600 parole board hearings scheduled. Most of them were postponed or waived or something. But of those that happened, about 1,234 people got a parole grant, were found suitable, and 2,227 got denied. So that comes out to roughly 36% versus 64%, which is really record high, right? It was typically 5% got found suitable for parole and under prior governors. So it is, something's working, right? And I will say it's not necessarily the parole board decision makers, it's pressure from above, because California was sued over its prison system overcrowding. You may know this. And in 2011, Brown versus Plata, the Supreme Court said California is violating people's human rights by putting them in prisons that are double capacity, and it's endangering it was causing overcrowding and to the point where the healthcare suffered so much, there was one unnecessary death every week in a California prison. And so they were under strict orders from the US Supreme Court to reduce their population. That trickles down eventually. And you look at the parole situation and these long-term offenders who almost never reoffend, and there's pressure coming from somewhere to say, let some of these folks out. And so that's what's happened. Yes. Excellent question. I wish I had that power. I'm just a teacher. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this study, it was actually initially at the urging of a public defender from LA who was dealing with these cases, is so that there be some kind of data knowledge base for challenging some of those reversals and some of those denials of resentencing petitions and things like that, because there was no systematic data on this happening. And so because I saw that there were going to be more resentencing petitions coming in different forms, I wanted to make sure that they had something social scientific to rely on to make arguments that no, this is an appropriate source of information for this. So that was one of them. And I have done some consulting and expert witness work along those lines. I gave a lecture to the Santa Cruz public defenders about how to use this information so that they could use it in their cases. I had in the works, had been invited by the San Francisco DA to give a workshop on this at the DA's office. And of course he was recalled, so that didn't happen. But that's the idea in terms of public policy. I wanted there to be some reliable information about it. Academically, I'm guessing article. I've already written one article that was published in the Journal of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. And it was really geared toward their professional use. And I'll probably publish some others too. Yeah, Katie.
So I'm wondering about the work that got to the root of the, what do you call it, over
Civilization, yeah.
Because I just, a lot, unlike San Quentin, most prisons, they say Bible college.
Yeah.
Program is you go in there and you just take responsibility.
Right.
Sort of other origins of it.
Mm-hmm.
In the way prisons are run apart from sort of preparing yourself for parole. It's sort of like, you break them down the minute they come in.
Yeah.
It's like just the hair shirt,
Yeah.
And the hair shirt, for anyone who doesn't know that preference, is like the Protestant wearing of the uncomfortable shirt so that your back bleeds, so you're reminded what a sinner you are.
Right.
And so I've just wondered about sort of what the roots are of that.
Yeah.
Side of parole. And I also wonder about like an organization.
Yeah.
And whether in preparing people, if there's another kind of language that's used that then is not as acceptable to what's going on with the digging through and catching
Right.
people, like minutes
Right.
that they, right?
Right.
What's the term?
Over responsibilization or over responsibilizing or techniques of responsibilization. Yeah, so that's a good question. And there's so many different cultures and prisons and different segments of the prison that it's almost hard to identify, right? And I'll answer your second question about uncommon law in a moment, but I think that it's hard to identify because of that symbiotic process, right? Ultimately, the origin of all of this is the structure of power relations, right? Because the parole board makes demands that are supposedly representative of the state's demands of people getting out of prison, the people's demands, the governor's demands. And so everyone's rushing to kind of meet those demands in different ways. And one of the problems is that it's a moving target because every few years, the parole board shifts in terms of what they're looking for. And so you're constantly trying to adapt the language and adapt the teaching so that it fits what they want. But that's only one piece of it. That's not the deeply cultural part, right? Another deeply cultural part, I think, is something you identified, which is religion becomes a very strong motivator in prison for reform. And there's a lot in Judeo-Christian religions about seeking forgiveness, right? And the original sin and all, all that. And so I think maybe some of it comes from that, but really is that process of being beaten down and then eventually realizing, I had someone talk to me, talk to one of my classes recently who was incarcerated for 30 years. And he said basically, I never saw it during those years of Pete Wilson and Gray Davis and stuff, or Schwarzenegger, where no one was getting out of prison. He's like, I never programmed because I didn't see any reason to. No one ever got out of prison. But he said the first time I saw that bus come in and pick this guy up and take him, and I said, where's he going? And people said, he's going home. Something clicked, and they were like, I'm going to do whatever he did. And that's what happens a lot. I hear that multiplied, right? Through the folks that I work with. So I think those are some strands, but the short answer is I don't know. Yeah. That's a really good question. So there's only one women's prison in California. And when I say I made the population representative in my sample, that meant including about 5 women, because that's representative. There's very few women incarcerated with life sentences. And I should say also that the CDCR has recently begun recognizing someone's chosen gender identity, but that didn't end up in the sample. There wasn't anyone who identified as they, them or anything. I had a very small sample, so it's hard to make generalizations. I would say that from what I can tell so far, you have to look at the intersection of race and gender to see how that plays out. And B, because it plays out differently. And B, women are kind of held accountable if they don't cry in a weird way. Like they're kind of expected to cry. Some men cry too. And strictly speaking, it shouldn't make a difference either way to the parole board. But I remember speaking with the lawyer representing one of the women's board hearings who I observed, and she said that she was kind of surprised that this person didn't, she's different from a lot of the women she represents the parole board because she didn't really cry that much. She kind of broke at one moment, but it almost seems like that outward display of emotion is more socially expected from women. Yeah. Okay, so the Board of Parole Hearings is a body of how many people? I think it's 18 or something for the entire state. And they kind of circle around the different prisons. I'm not sure if they're back to in person or not. All of these ones were via Zoom. But the Board of Parole Hearings is centered in Sacramento. And then in the old days, they would travel around 2 or 3 commissioners at a time to the different prisons to hold the hearing. They hold like a week of hearings at a time. They usually see 2, maybe 3 people a day. The time that it takes is very variable. When I first started working in San Quentin, having people go to the parole board, it could take 6, 7, 8 hours. These days, it's more like 2 to 3. And they often go over, or maybe they go under, but not as frequently. It's a pretty long session. And as far as I know, it's kind of luck of the draw. Thank you. It's kind of luck of the draw which commissioners you get that day. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned exoneration projects. What do those look like? Are those like,
Yeah.
what are the criteria for them to, okay, maybe this person's actually.
Okay, that it varies by project. Some of them are strictly DNA based. The famous Innocence Project from New York is DNA based. Other ones don't require DNA. So it just depends on that particular project. All of them are, yes, nonprofit, usually run out of law schools. We had the Northern California Innocence Project that covers this area is run out of Santa Clara Law School. And they are overwhelmed typically with cases. They take very few. They study them for a long time, sometimes years before they decide to take on a case. Yeah. We're good? All right. Oh, okay. So here's the problem. Most lower security prisons don't have prisoners who go to parole board because they're not the type of sentence. They have shorter determinate sentences. The only people, as I said, who go to the parole board are people with indeterminate, 10, 15 to life, 25 to life. And so they could be, people in that situation can work their way down security levels, but they don't tend to go to an all low security prison. They tend to stay in one like San Quentin where they've got levels 1 through 4, but they operate at level 2, right? And so it wouldn't change much because of the nature of who goes to the parole board. Immigrants to the US? Yeah, there were a number of immigrants actually that came up in my observations. And typically the parole board is tasked with providing a translator if they need it. What I have witnessed is that the quality of the translators varies quite a bit. And that they sometimes have trouble finding a translator for languages that are not spoken as commonly, but it does exist. I've seen some parole board commissioners who go easier because they know the person is having a hard time communicating and they kind of feed them words, and others where they don't give them any kind of credit for the lack of communication and just assume they have no insight. Really just, it depends on the commissioner quite a bit. Yeah.